I have been trying to find a way to break down the boundary between childhood and adulthood. And actually, in that way, to try and bring children and older people together into some kind of collaboration. So I've just finished a book called The Rise and Fall of Generation Now. It's not about any particular generation, but about the way in which we tend to think about generations. And that way is to suppose that there's an intermediate generation, that is adults like you and I, who get in between the young who are being prepared for society and the very old who are past it. So we have this kind of model, in a sort of three-generation model, in which we have the people in the middle who are planning everything, making history, doing their stuff. We have the children who are being prepared for entry into society, and we have the old people who are now going off the stage. What I want to do, and I think this resonates with what art, many kinds of art are also trying to do, is to take away the power of that middle generation and to bring the old and the young together into a mutual collaboration. Art and childhood could come together by, in some ways, trying to get rid of the category of childhood. I mean, it's all right to talk about children, but to set up childhood as a separate state, as distinct from middle age and elderhood, I think is perhaps a mistake. So instead of thinking of these generations as confronting one another face to face, I think we should be trying to induce an attitude of what I've called companionship, in which they're going along in the same directions. That's where art could come in suggesting a posture that is less confrontational between generations. I've not got an example of what has been done, but I do have an example of what could be done, in the sense that I've often thought that we should regard the school as a work of art. Imagine a school. It's a building, it's lots of activities, lots of people who are coming together in a particular place in the middle of a community, a village or whatever, town. And we tend to think of art as a subject that's taught in schools, along with history and geography and maths and all these other things. But what if instead we said that, no, actually, the school is a work of art that has been continually co-produced by everybody in the community who has a stake in it, the children in particular, but the teachers as well, and the parents and everybody else. It will become this thing which everybody is continually growing, and which they're then quite pleased to show to people from elsewhere. So sort of, look at what we've got. That's how I tend to think of it. And I mean, maybe there are artworks already of this kind which can grow and live through the continual inputs of different people who are involved in it one way and another. But I think, but I don't have an example exactly of that. But I think that's how it should be done. I have to write a little essay relating to a piece of the artist Francis Alice, who made a collection of 33 children's games. They're short, sort of 5-minute videos taken from all around the world, and they're quite amazing. Because in each game, the kids are just coming together and almost spontaneously doing something, from playing a game of marbles to racing snails to everything. But it's incredibly joyful. And what strikes me is the difference between these kinds of games, which kids just play and improvise, and the children's games you buy from the shop, which come in a box, and you give for birthdays and Christmas, and the kids play with it for a little while until they get bored, and it gets put under the bed or sent to the charity shop, and then you have to get another one and another one. So that this whole the whole gaming industry has become commercialized things in which enjoyment or joy is something that you can buy and sell. So you buy this game and you'll get lots of enjoyment from it. As though you pay your money and you get your joy. And these films really are wonderfully sort of expressive counterpoint to that. And I think that's also what's necessary, because he argued that joy can't be can't be produced to order. It just arises because the thing about it is by nature that it's always an excess, that it's always unplanned, that it's always spontaneous. It wouldn't be joy otherwise. And how it comes, not you can't be consumed because it can only arise in co-production when people actually come together to produce something, and it has to be collective. You can't have joy on your own. There's always been this problem with anthropology and childhood. For a long time, anthropology proceeded as though children didn't exist, and that I was supposed to think that eventually, anthropology discovered women, maybe in the 1970s, 1980s, but they still have forgotten all about children. And it was only much later they began to recognize that actually a lot of people in society are kids. And there have been various attempts to develop an anthropology of childhood, but they're always stymied by the problem that either it's still treating the children somehow as objects of inquiry, and that you're basically doing research with adults about children, asking them about children, how they manage children, how they deal with children, but it's still basically research with the grown-ups. Or you have to somehow participate with the kids, but that's a virtually impossible thing to do because you're an adult. It's sort of impossible although attempts have been made, it is very difficult for a researcher to participate with children in the same way that they would participate with adults for rather obvious reasons. And then there are all the ethical problems. The anthropology hasn't really got to grips with children or childhood. It doesn't really have the concept to deal with it. Classically, it didn't have the concept because the structure theory that we'd inherited from people like Durkheim, the theory was that childhood was basically about becoming a person, growing up from being just a sort of more or less a biological being to becoming a social being, and then being able to participate in society. So that childhood was just a kind of preparation for social life that immediately pushed children out into the margin. They weren't really there, not because socially they were somehow peripheral, but because the very theoretical framework of the discipline was marginalizing children. I think we've got beyond that now, in that we can now begin to see social life more as a process of becoming, and I've been part of that to some extent, to try and think of not human beings but human becomings, to think of every human being as their entire life history, life trajectory, and to say that children are every bit as social at the beginning of life as they are at the end. You don't become more social. Children are born right into the very heart of a field of social relations, and that means that we can begin to think about children as fully social beings, are all alike. And then they're gradually differentiated, being socialized into this culture or the other culture. And that still reproduces the idea of the child as somehow this raw material that is waiting to be shaped. I mean, take in anthropology, everybody's going on about Philippe Descola and his wretched four ontologies. You're either an animist or a naturalist or an analogist or a totemist. And then you say, okay, how is it that a child born in France or the Great Britain would tend to end up being a naturalist? Or a child born in Amazonia would tend to end up being an animist? Or a child born in an Australian Aboriginal community would end up tending to be a totemist? And the only answer you can give is, well, it must be through some process of socialization. And then it immediately says, okay, so the child is just raw material waiting to be socialized. And that then reproduces that very opposition between the raw material of humanity and the social, even ontological forms into which it's being induced. So that's our problem. How do we deal with cultural variation from the very start of life? And I don't think we've really got a solution for it yet. It's not enough to have an ontological term. We have to have an ontogenetic one. we have to focus on the processes of ontogenesis and look at those right from the start. And then maybe the next thing would be to recognize the extent to which the sensibilities of children, even at birth, are shaped by the experience of the mother before the child is born. I think this is sort of neglected, but we know, for example, that children's hearing or an infant's hearing is already fully functional. I forget now, the 26th week of pregnancy or something. Anyway, well before it's born, and probably the child is also accustomed to certain kinds of movement and rhythm because they're inside the mother who's doing certain kinds of move, and people in different societies are moving in different ways into different rhythms, and so that the child will already have developed a sensibility to these before they're even born. So the idea that the child comes into the world as a blank slate is clearly nonsense. We need, I think, to focus on those conditions in which children come into the world. I don't know how we do that, but that's what I would do. About what it means to tread in the footsteps of your predecessors, because your ancestors, maybe parents, grandparents, whatever, are going before you. They're not in the past, they're actually in the future. So what does it mean if you're following in the footsteps? You haven't put these paths sort of down into a heritage, into the past, but you're actually following in the footsteps of where your ancestors have been before. Then your ancestors are up ahead and you're following behind. So these people we tend to think are in the past are actually in the future. And the question is there any moment at which we actually overtake them? One theory would be that, eventually I've been following my dad in the woods and we go for walks, right? And he takes the lead and I've trotted along behind. But eventually, he passed away. So he falls away and you carry on. So it's like a relay. You write one leg, then you pass the baton on to the next, who then goes like that, and then the next one goes. So in that model, where each generation is overtaking, picking up the baton and then overtaking the one before. But I don't think that's how it is. I don't think there is a moment of overtaking. And certainly I think for many indigenous people who say that following their ancestors is what they do, and that's what tradition means, that they would never dream of overtaking their ancestors. So their ancestors are always kind of both in front and behind at the same time. And in that sense, people can say that they're actually carried by their ancestors. Because when you're carried, the carrier is both in front and behind at the same time. You're held by it. So I've been thinking a bit about that and about the problem we run into in modern societies when we break that, when we say that there comes a moment when we turn our backs on our ancestors. And when a child first comes into the world and in their very early years, they're following their mother, maybe the father. Anyway, the parents are sort of going ahead and they're following. And then there has to come a point where they're told, you can't do that anymore. You have to turn around and face the future, which is coming at them. So instead of following the people who've been going before you, your parents and your grandparents, you have to turn around, put the parents and the grandparents at your back and face a future that is coming towards you. And that's the only road to progress, is to break with the past and face in the opposite direction. So there's a point, or we imagine that there's a point in the career of every child in which they have to do this turnaround. I think sometimes that's what education is trying to do, is trying to get the child to turn around and face the future instead of just carrying on towards the past. And that creates this break, this rupture between the young and the old, which is rather fundamental to the doctrine of progress, but I think does tend to generate a degree of ruin.